Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today's topic is genealogy jargon defined. If you are new to family history, you may feel like you are learning a new language. There's a lot of acronyms that fly around, there are a lot of unfamiliar terms, and sometimes there are words that we use in family history and genealogy that are used entirely different elsewhere in the world. And so this presentation actually was born out of a conversation I had on Twitter a few months ago, and I've been thinking about it a lot since then and paying attention to the way that we use words. This particular Twitter interaction was about a woman who was approaching me asking questions about DNA, and I asked a clarifying question back, and I asked her something about her pedigree. And she came back very offended and flew off the handle at me and called me some unsavory names because in her mind, the word pedigree was a very specific term that was applied to animals. Dogs have pedigrees, horses have pedigrees, and she had never heard that term in relation to family trees. And so she thought I was being insulting, and then she was offended, and it just kind of devolved from there. And no matter how I tried to explain it, she wasn't in a space to listen. And so I've been thinking about that a lot and really just wanted to put together this presentation for those of you who are new to family history so that you can start to get familiar with some of the words that we used and the context in which we use them. For those of you who've been with us for a while, there may still be some acronyms that fly around that you have to ask about. There may be terms that you come across in records that you're interested in learning more about. And so I hope I've got a little something for everybody today. If you're new, we'll kind of start off slow. If things get over your head or a little overwhelming, don't panic. Much like learning a new language, if you immerse yourself in it, you won't understand everything at first. But that immersion process eventually gets you to a place where things start to make more sense. For those of you who've been doing family history forever, again, we're going to start out slow for the newbies, but hopefully as we get a little bit further on, there'll be something new that you will learn as well. So let's go ahead and dive in. First, let's just talk about some basic definitions of the words that we use a lot. For example, the word ancestry. Yes, it's the name of a website, the company that I work for, but it also is a genealogical term. Ancestry is simply anybody in your lineage, another word we use, that has the name or the word parent in it. So your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and so on and so forth, right? So that is your ancestry or your ancestors. Another word that we use is the word descendant. So a descendant is anyone to whom the word child can be applied. So your child, your grandchild, your great-grandchild, and so on. Okay? So ancestry and descendant have some really specific meanings. Well, then what do you call everybody else? The aunts and the uncles and the cousins, we just call them relatives, right? Anybody that is related to you, and you can have people who are related by blood, you can have people who are related by marriage, but they're just called relatives. Sometimes we use the term or the phrase collateral relatives, meaning people who have married into the family that aren't part of that direct line or that ancestry or descendancy. Hopefully that clears a few things up as it relates to that. Now, when we talk about how we're related to people, we have words for all of those things. Hopefully all of you know what a sibling is, for example. A sibling is a singular word that we use to describe a brother or sister, okay? Now, we don't have, at least I'm not aware of a word for aunt and uncle, but there's a singular word for that. I know that in many different languages, they do have words for paternal aunt and a maternal aunt, and they're two different words. So in English, we use language sometimes differently than it's used in other countries. Now there's also words that we use here like niece and nephew, and there is a word, a singular word for both of those things. It's the children of your sibling. The children of your sibling are nieces and nephews, and the singular word for that is nibbling. Maybe that was something new to you. Okay. We also have the word or the phrase in-law. Now, here's where things start to get a little bit tricky because In-law today typically means somebody who has married into your family. So your daughter's husband would be your son-in-law. Your husband's sister would be your sister-in-law. So we use that term to mean specific relationships. Now, it's important to understand that historically, that word has not always meant the same thing that it does today to so many of us. Historically, the word in-law just meant anybody who by law was considered a part of your family. So if you adopted a child, they might be called your son-in-law, right? Or if there was some legal connection, guardianship of some sort between you and a niece or a nephew, they might also be called your in-law, right? Any kind of legal relationship that exists in a family, that term could be applied historically. So if you're looking at records, current records, that term has a very specific meaning. But as you start to go back further in history in your family tree, you need to be aware that the meaning of that word has changed over time. Okay, now something that hasn't changed over time but that still confuses a whole lot of people are cousin relationships. So this abbreviation or some form of it, you're going to probably start to see as you participate in Facebook groups and as you start to get more involved in family history, you'll see things like first cousin once removed, right? 1C, 1R, that's what that stands for, first cousin once removed. You could have a 3C, 4R or whatever combination of that is, but it just simply means cousin and then however removed they are. Now, I don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty of exactly how you figure that out. In fact, I've done an entire video called What is a First Cousin Once Removed? You can find it on the Ancestry YouTube channel. But I just wanted you to know this abbreviation you might start to see, and that's what that means, okay? Sometimes we also see words in records that, again, don't always mean what we think they mean based on current usage of the word. For example, the word orphan in describing someone in a family today typically means they have lost both parents. Both parents are deceased and that child then is an orphan. Historically, someone could be called in records an orphan if just one of their parents died. So they could still have a living parent and a deceased parent and be called an orphan. Another word that sometimes confuses people in records is when we see the word guardian. Now, guardianship today typically means someone who has lost their parents either to death or other circumstances, needs an adult to take care of them, and that adult becomes their legal guardian. Historically, so when you start digging into historical records, sometimes you will find things called guardianship papers, and that guardianship just simply means that the court has appointed an individual as a guardian to underage children to protect their interests, whether those interests are financial or otherwise. So, for example, if a woman dies, but she had inherited some things from her family, and that stuff was held then in trust for her children, a guardian might be appointed that is not the father of those children or the stepfather of those children to protect the financial interests of that trust until those children come of age. Okay, so guardianship does not always mean that the child has been removed from the home or that their parents are both deceased. Historically, it has a little bit of a different meaning. Okay, let's get back to some basics here again. Okay, this is where this whole presentation started for me, was with that Twitter conversation. So a family tree, if somebody asks if you have a family tree, and I get messages like this all the time, right? What they're asking sometimes is, do you know your family history? Do you know who your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were? Sometimes when they say, do you have a family tree, what they mean is, do you have a family tree online at Ancestry and where can I find it? Right? So it's one of those phrases that we use when we're doing family history research and interacting with others to make new discoveries, that we need to make sure that we're clear about how we're using it. So I often, when I write this phrase into an email or on a Facebook messages, I clarify it with the word online family tree. Do you have an online family tree, and where can I view that? Or I see that you don't have a tree online at Ancestry. Where can I find your family tree information? Do you have it on another website? Is it in a binder in your office, right? So sometimes that phrase gets used a little bit differently for different people. Now here's the phrase that started it all, right? Pedigree chart. A pedigree chart is simply a view of a person and their ancestors. Remember the word ancestors, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. Pedigree charts do not include siblings and aunts and uncles and cousins and all the people in the family, right? It just includes ancestors. Typically, like on Ancestry, that pedigree view of your family tree is going to be 5 or 6 generations. There are companies that will print out your family pedigree for tons of generations, if, however far back your research goes. I have one that hangs on my wall in my home that I think has 9 generations for both my parents. So you can have all sorts of views of your pedigree chart on a computer screen, print it out hanging on a wall in your home, lots of different ways that that can be displayed. Another phrase that sometimes confuses people is family group sheet or family group record. Now this is a view like the profile view on Ancestry or the family group sheet view on Ancestry, where you can just view a single family. Now, the way that that's typically defined for a family group sheet purpose is an individual, their spouse or spouses, their children, and their parents. Okay? So again, you don't have a whole extended family, but it's different than a pedigree view because it allows you to view a family in some context. I personally use the profile view on Ancestry. That is the home base from where I do all of my research. It's my workspace. I view hints from there. I do my searches from there. I keep my notes in there, all because I want to be able to view the family in context. Who are the parents? Who's the individual? Who is their spouse? Who are their children? What are the dates for everybody involved? It gives me this singular view to be able to work from so that when I find records or when I'm viewing hints, I know that I'm doing it in context of that family, and it means I make a lot fewer mistakes, right? I know that when I find a record, it's for this family because I've got that context right there in front of me. Okay, this brings us to some words and phrases and concepts that we use when we talk about how we do the data entry of information into our family tree. So I will just remind you that women are always, did I get enough of those in there? Always entered into the family tree with their maiden name, full stop, right? You enter a woman's given name or names, and then her maiden name or the name she was born with. You don't have to worry about entering the name of her husband or husbands, right? Because sometimes people are married lots of times. You're not going to be entering all of those names in there. So you just enter a woman with her maiden name, and then as you add her spouse or spouses, that information gets put together there on that profile screen in that family view. And as you do searches, and as you're served up hints, it takes into account those married names. Now, if you don't know a woman's maiden name, you can leave the field blank. I have decided that I want to put in 5 underscores. It makes a nice little line, and it doesn't affect my searches or my hints, and it allows me to know that I'm missing some information that I need to go track down. I do that because if you get far enough back in time and in different cultures, having a surname is actually not a thing. And so if it's blank, to me in my tree, what that signifies is this person does not have a last name. So I use the 5 underscores when I don't know a person's maiden name or surname in order to signify that. Now, another thing that has to do with names is what we call patronymics. If you're not familiar with that, typically we're going to see this most often in Scandinavian countries, where John Peterson's children become the Johnsons, right? They take their father's first name, their patra, their father's mimic name, their father's first name, and put on either son or daughter at the end, and that becomes their surname or their patronymic. So Sven Williamson's children become, William Svensson. So every generation, what we think about sometimes as the last name or the family name gets changed because it's not a family name, it's called a patronymic. That's what that word means. And then another thing we sometimes see as we're doing data entry into trees is titles. And I just want to be really clear that a title, while we sometimes think of it as part of the name, typically isn't, right? Somebody might be a reverend or a doctor or a king, but they weren't born with that name. That is a title that is bestowed upon them at a certain point in their life. And so you can enter it into the tree with a fact that has the title that they were bestowed or earned and the date and place where they obtained that title. So it allows you to keep an accurate record of their life and recognizing that they may have used that title as part of their name later in life, but that's not their given name or their surname, which is what goes in the name field. Okay, lots of other little tips about how to do the data entry in your tree to keep things really clean and clear and understandable for you and for those who might be viewing your tree. It'll make sure that your hints and your searches are going accurate. Again, I've done a video all about that. We'll be sure to provide a link for that as well. Now, that moves us into the kinds of records that you're going to be using as you build your family tree and continue to make discoveries. And again, sometimes we use words or phrases that everybody's not familiar with, so I want to quickly run through some of these. We use the term vital records. And in family history, when we're talking about vital records, we are specifically talking about birth, marriage, or death records. Now, sometimes those records might be church records, in which case instead of a birth record, you'll have a christening record, and instead of a death record, you'll have a burial record. But those records typically will have that vital information on them: birth date and place, marriage date and place, death date and place. You'll also see some other words or phrases or acronyms that come up as you do vital records research. Things like banns, right? That's just simply a posting of an intention to marry for a certain number of weeks before a marriage is performed. Bonds. Bond is something that was posted. An individual became a bondsman. They posted a certain amount of bond or agreed to a certain amount if the groom bailed on the marriage or if it was found after he had declared his intention to marry a young woman that he was ineligible for marriage, he had to forfeit a bond. And so we see that sometimes. And so sometimes we use those bands or those bonds as a type of marriage record. The phrase or the word obit, right? It's just a shortening or a shorthand of the word obituary, but I've seen some people as we use that obit, they don't know what we're talking about. So I wanted to make sure that was really clear. And then we start to see some acronyms of things like SSDI. That simply stands for Social Security Death Index. It's a database of records available on Ancestry. Censuses, okay? So census records, every 10 years here in the United States and in England and Canada, less or more often in various places throughout the world, and sometimes even down at a state level. Censuses are simply an enumeration. There's another fancy word, right? Accounting or an accounting of every individual who lives in a certain place. So here in the United States, we started the US federal census in 1790. It is still taken every 10 years today on the 10s. The 1890 census was destroyed in a fire, so it's missing. The 1940 census is the most recent publicly available census. We have a privacy law here in the United States that is 72 years. So the 1950 census becomes publicly available in 2022. So census records are a foundational record that we use in family history research because starting in 1850, every single person in a household is listed. It lists their age, it lists their birthplace, it lists occupations, it lists educational status and sometimes financial status. Sometimes it lists relationships of the people in the household. Like census records are really important and hopefully you'll start to understand that as you get into family history. Another record type we talk about is immigration records. Now immigration records have all sorts of variants. Sometimes it is an actual passenger list of the person crossing from Hamburg into New York on a certain date and time, and it contains a lot of really specific detailed information. Sometimes an immigration record is just a listing of the passengers on this ship in a newspaper in New York about who came into port the day before. Sometimes it has to do with actual naturalization paperwork. So after people have been in a particular country for a period of time, they can apply to become a citizen of that country. And here in the United States, that naturalization process produces a lot of paperwork. And so we have something called first papers, which people file, which is a declaration of an intention to become a citizen. And then they file their petition to naturalize, and then they have or receive their naturalization certificate. So lots of paperwork that's created through the immigration process throughout time. And so we have lots of those records to deal with. Another record type that we use quite a bit, particularly prior to the 1850 census, when people started being listed by name, is probate records. Now, probate is a word that we use to describe the entire process, the entire legal process that goes on after a person dies. So typically, a will is involved. But if a will is not involved, we would say that person died intestate, meaning they died without a will, in which case then there's more paperwork generated sometimes by the court system as they try to determine who the inheritors are. They typically will appoint an executor of the estate. And when we say estate, we don't mean that person was wealthy and had a huge amount of property necessarily. They could have been very poor and had very little, and that would still be considered that person's estate. And it would still have to be settled because the property and the inheritance process has to be worked out through legal channels. And so probate records very often produce, again, an enormous amount of paperwork, and Ancestry has digitized a lot of those records and placed them online. Now, everything we have online, Social Security Death Index, birth, marriage, and death records from churches as well as from governments, probate records, land records, I mean, I could go on and on, military records. All of those are on Ancestry in individual databases. So when somebody talks about the Ancestry database, really, Ancestry has a collection of more than 32,000 different databases containing 22 billion records, with another 1 to 2 million records added every single day. So each collection of records on Ancestry is its own individual database. So again, why is this important? Well, when you're communicating with others, when you're on Ancestry's Facebook page asking for help from myself or from other Ancestry members or from genealogists out in Facebook groups or on message boards, or when you're sending an email message or an Ancestry message to a cousin whose tree you found online, using the correct language means you're more likely to be understood without frustration, and it also means that you're going to be communicating more effectively and getting the answers that you want. So sometimes it's just important to understand some of these little nuances of language. Now, when we talk about databases of records, there's also some things to understand about Ancestry, which is sometimes all Ancestry can obtain is an index, meaning all we have is a transcription or a copy of some of the information off of the original record, wherever that original record might live. Sometimes we also have images that go along with that index, meaning you can actually go in and view the original census image or the original passenger list. And so understanding the nuances between indexes and images on Ancestry will just help you be more successful in making family history discoveries, and understanding what is an original record and what is not an original record will also help you to be more successful. Again, I've done some videos both on index-only records at Ancestry. That's what the video is called, index-only records. And I've done a video on image-first databases on Ancestry. And you can find both of those here on the Ancestry YouTube channel. Now, when we talk about original records, we start using words like research and documentation. And sometimes when you ask for help about something, somebody will say, well, what documentation do you have? Well, I did an entire video on that specific question last week. Again, you can find that here on the YouTube channel, and it explains that in great detail. But when we talk about research, what we're talking about is getting into the records and actually starting to understand them and make discoveries in those records. It's not just copying information from other people. And so there's an entire concept in family history, and if you're new, this might be a little bit overwhelming, but just take a deep breath, you'll get it eventually. The genealogical proof standard is what we call that research process. It's 5 steps, and I've done an entire 6 video, because there was an introduction and then the 5 steps, 6 video series on the genealogical proof standard. So again, if you're new to family history, you might want to hop back here on the Ancestry YouTube channel, find that genealogical proof standard playlist. There's a whole playlist, has all 6 of those videos in it. Take your time, take some notes, watch it. I've been doing family history since I was 12 pretty actively. I still try to attend at least one class every single genealogical conference I go to, and I go to a minimum of 5 a year. I try to attend at least one class where someone with more or different or better experience than I have in the genealogical proof standard is teaching, and every time I learn something. So if you're new, don't be overwhelmed. If you've been doing this a really long time, you might be surprised that you don't know what you don't know, which is what I always learn when I take those particular classes. One of the things that I learn about is sources and source citations. Another one of the things I learn about is the difference between information and evidence and proof. And all of those are concepts that we start to put together to lead us to conclusions that is the information or the data that we enter into our family trees. So get your head wrapped around that idea, or dip your toe in that water now, and you'll find that your family history journey will be a lot more successful and probably a lot more fun too in the long run. Now, I just want to wrap up with a couple of other concepts. We talk about repositories a lot. I talk about them a lot, so if you listen to any videos from me, you'll hear me use that term or the phrase repositories and libraries and archives. Essentially, this is anywhere where Ancestry obtains records. It's also a place where you can go to obtain records, right? So there are lots of them. The National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, here in the United States. The National Archives, or TNA, in England. The Public Records Office is what it's called in Ireland. The Library Archives Canada is what it's called in Canada, right? So every country has a national archive. We also then see that states have archives, sometimes counties have archives, sometimes even cities have archives or historical societies. Then we have Family Search. Family Search is an organization that's been collecting family history records for decades, and they have the largest offline collection of genealogical records in the world, held at the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, the FHL. And they have satellite family history centers, or FHCs, throughout the world where you can access some of the information remotely. Then also, most counties, cities, regions in the world have either a genealogical society or a family history society. Sometimes they just have a history society. Sometimes they have all 3. And some of those organizations have spent decades collecting information, creating indexes and finding aids to local records that will help you do research in a specific area. And sometimes just the information that they have available can help you make sense of some of the records that you're finding online at Ancestry. So repositories, get familiar with the ones in the areas where your family is from. Now, a little bit of alphabet soup for you for just a minute. There are larger genealogical organizations that you might not be aware of, and you may see some of these acronyms floating around the internet. So NGS stands for the National Genealogical Society here in the United States. FGS is the Federation of Genealogical Societies, and it is an umbrella organization for genealogical societies around the world. IJGS is the International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies, and as its name suggests, is an umbrella organization for Jewish genealogical societies around the world. NEHGS is the New England Historical Genealogical Society. It's based out of Boston, and they've been for a couple of centuries now collecting information from families in New England and genealogical records available about those families. On the right side here, we've got the Board for Certification of Genealogists, or BCG. You do not have to be a professional genealogist to be a member of this organization. And what the purpose of this organization is to certify genealogists. Basically, it tests your skills in the genealogical proof standard and in doing research and writing up that research in an understandable way. So anybody who has certified will usually have the letters CG, Certified Genealogist, behind their name when you see them in a program, at a speaking event, or sometimes in various places on the internet. ICAPGen is an organization that does genealogy accreditation. So certification tests genealogical skill and writing skill. ICAPGen accredits individual genealogists in specific areas. Because just because I might know how to do research in England doesn't mean I know how to do research in Louisiana, because the records are different and the laws were different, and there's a lot of different nuances to the kinds of things that the kinds of skills that I might need to do research in a particular time or place. Sometimes it's a language issue. Germany research is very different than research in Mexico. Okay? So ICAPGen accredits genealogists in specific regions or areas of the world or types of records. So that those individuals will have an AG behind their name. So sometimes you'll see individuals that are a CG and an AG, and sometimes that AG represents more than one region. Maybe they've been accredited in 2 or 3 or 5 different regions. Then there is the Fellows of the Association of, or wow, let's try that again. The Fellows of the American Society of Genealogists, right? So we have individuals who also, because of their longevity in the industry and their experience, you'll see some of those initials behind their name. There's lots of others. Those are the big ones. APG, the Association of Professional Genealogists, they don't put postnomials, so there's no initials behind someone's name, but it is an organization that individuals can belong to do some career development if they want to become a professional genealogist. FS is the abbreviation for Family Search. Again, they have the Family History Library and Family History Centers around the world. Then, so those are the genealogical societies and the certification and accreditation organizations. Then there are lineage societies, and there are literally like hundreds of them around the world. I will just point out a couple of them that you will probably hear about most often if you do US research, and those are the Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR, and the Sons of the American Revolution, the SAR. There's also the Mayflower Society, and there's the Society of Early American Witches, which I am eligible to become a member of. Lots of different lineage societies. And essentially, in order to become a member, what you have to do is you have to be able to prove with documentation or genealogical proof your ancestry from yourself back to an individual who, in this case, served in the Revolutionary War in some capacity, or was an early American witch, or came over on the Mayflower, or whatever the society's focus is. Now, when we talk about DAR and SAR, I thought I'd throw these little acronyms up because we actually just ran into this week here in some research we were doing at Ancestry. There is a difference between someone who served in the American Revolution, sometimes abbreviated as AMREV in records, and for the US or Patriot side, versus someone who served in the American Revolution for the British side. And so sometimes you'll see UEL, or United Empire Loyalists, right? So loyalists were those who fought in the Revolution for the British side. Of course, they don't call it the American Revolution, right? All depends on what direction you're looking at that from. And sometimes what you'll see is individuals who had been living in the colonies, sometimes even in the same family or cousins with the same or similar names one served for one side and one served for the other. And sometimes they get confused. And so that's the situation we ran across this week was there's a whole bunch of people who had joined the DAR through the lineage of a particular individual that they thought was a patriot, and it turns out that they were a loyalist, and they had been confused with another individual. So when we get deep into records and when you start looking into some of those things, you have to pay attention to some of those little details. And sometimes the only little detail is those little letters UEL tacked on to someone's name in a book or in some other kind of record. Okay, you'll also see little acronyms thrown around, things like GEDCOM. GEDCOM just stands for Genealogical Data Communications File. Basically, it's a way to take your family tree data, export it into a format that can then be read by any genealogical software or program. Two of the software programs that are compatible with Ancestry Online Trees are FTM, or Family Tree Maker. It's the one that I use, or Roots Magic, which is sometimes abbreviated as RM. So you'll see that around sometimes. Now, you want to get really deep into records, you'll realize that very quickly, particularly if you're dealing with Catholic records or records at various places, throughout various places in Europe, even if Latin was not the language being used, even if it was, a totally different language, you will sometimes see Latin abbreviations or Latin words being used in family history records. And we have found that that has seeped into a lot of US records over time as well. So sometimes it's helpful to understand what some of those terms mean. For example, me, right? It just is a word for birth, and typically what it refers to is a woman's maiden name. So she was born this, right? And so that's where you'll see that word show up. That next word there, I'm not even going to try and pronounce, well, I am going to try and pronounce it. Uxer, I don't know how it's pronounced. I don't speak Latin, but I do know that every time I see that word, it means wife, right? Similarly, consort. The only difference with consort is that consort can be a male or a female. So a consort is a spouse, male or female. A relict. Relict is a widow. So a consort typically, but not always, refers to a living spouse, whereas a relict refers to the surviving spouse after the previous one has died. Now, you may see this acronym show up. It is an acronym for a Latin term, right? Each of those letters represents a Latin word, but basically what it means is this person died without having progeny or children. This person had no children, okay? Ultimo, I've seen this in several records, including in some of the Quaker records that I deal with, and it is just a word that means last month. Okay, so sometimes you won't see an exact date in some records. You'll see words like this that mean a time relative to now. And in this case, ultimo means last month. And then there's a word that comes up that does not mean the video game that your grandchildren are playing right now. It actually means fortnight. It means 2 weeks. Right? And it is an old Latin word that has been modernized, but that we still don't use very often in our language today. Simply means 2 weeks. That brings us to DNA. Now, I'm not going to overwhelm you with a bunch of DNA language. However, you've probably noticed that as you've gotten involved in family history and DNA has become more of a thing, DNA feels like its own new language in and of itself. And so chromosomes is a word you're going to hear thrown around a lot. Essentially, every single one of us has 23 pairs of chromosomes. In each pair, we got one from mom and one from dad. So 50% of our DNA from each parent, and a chromosome is just the language that we use to describe those 23 pairs of DNA. Centimorgan, you'll hear that word thrown around a lot. It basically just means a measurement of DNA, and that is how we compare your DNA to someone else's DNA, and we tell you how many centimorgans of DNA you share. MRCA, you might see that's most recent common ancestor. So when you're talking about any two individuals, particularly DNA matches, what you're trying to figure out is who in their ancestry and their respective ancestry is the most recent common ancestor or ancestral couple. And then there's a phrase that gets thrown around quite a bit in some of the DNA Facebook groups. We're actually trying to turn the tide a little bit, because the original phrase was NPE, stood for non-paternal event, But what we've discovered is it's not always the father who is not the father. Sometimes it's the mother who's not the mother. Lots of different ways that can happen. And so the phrase that we're trying to move more toward in the genetic genealogy community is MPE, which stands for misattributed parentage event. So instead of non-paternal event, misattributed parentage event. And then you might also see the phrase mirror trees thrown around quite a bit in some of the DNA groups. When you're trying to solve a problem, people might think that's the solution to all your problems. But actually, mirror trees are an outdated methodology, and we want to move away from mirror trees. And so if you would join me next week, we'll be talking about that. I'll have Angie Bush here from Ancestry Pro Genealogists to join me, and we will be talking about some of the methodologies that we use that have replaced the need for mirror trees. Well, some just last tips, okay? When in doubt, if you have any question about what a word means, ask, right? Ancestry has a Facebook page. You can ask there. I monitor that. Several members of our member services team monitor that. And we have a tremendous community of about 2 million people on that Facebook page, so many of whom are so willing to help and are so knowledgeable. Just remember that words mean different things at different times in history and in different places in the world. So just because you think a word means something, don't automatically assign the meaning, your meaning to that word, particularly if it's something that you think is going to offend you, like my pedigree friend on Twitter. Maybe just ask first or do a little bit of internet searching on your own to see if you can figure out what some other possible meanings of that word might be. When you're communicating with others, whether it's through an Ancestry message or in a post on Facebook or an email to a cousin, or even the information you're putting in your own family tree, just be super clear. If you think that you're using an acronym or a symbol or some combination of information that makes sense to you, don't just think about what it means to you. Yes, it's your tree, but what are your children going to think when they inherit that information 20 or 30 years from now? Or what is your cousin going to think when you invite them to view your tree? Like, just be as clear as possible with all the information that you enter. And then the last tip is in the Ancestry help. So if you go to Ancestry, across the top there, you click on help, there's a support center. In the support center, once you click on that, you'll get a little search bar. Just type in the word glossary, hit search. You're going to get several articles. I think there's 4 or 5 of them. And each one of them has a bit of detail about all of the things that we've covered today and the multitude of things that I had no time to get to because unfortunately we are out of time. That is all I have prepared for you today, but hopefully it was enough information for you to start to become familiar with the words and phrases that we use in family history. If you're new, maybe if you've been doing this a while, you learned something new or a way in which you can share this information with people who are new, so that we can all be speaking the same genealogy language. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.